Gore Vidal is here. His latest book is called Inventing a Nation, Washington, Adams, Jefferson. I am pleased to have him here to talk about not only that, but other subjects. Welcome. Great to see you.
Good to see you again.
This comes from a conversation you had with John F. Kennedy some 40 years ago. You're in Hyannisport or somewhere.
Yeah, up in Hyannisport. It was the day, I think, the Berlin Wall was going up, and it looked like war. And Jack was a history buff, and he was puffing on a cigar, and we were playing backgammon and waiting for the war news to come in. And he suddenly started in, he said, you know, in this job, I get to meet everybody, all these famous movers and shakers that I've heard about all my life. And he said, you know, the thing I find so disturbing is how second-rate they all are. And then he said, I mean, who is Dean Rusk? Not that he isn't a very nice man and so on. In fact, he was in the administration.
Secretary of State of the United States.
Indeed he was.
Former chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Exactly. Well, Jack didn't know. Well, Jack said, look, the only people I know are politicians. I don't know anybody else.
Politicians.
And I'm faced every day with these resumes, and I meet these people. Then I was talking to your Uncle Lefty, who's an 18th century scholar, and he said how amazing it was that the United States, this little backwoods country with 3 million people, had produced the three greatest geniuses of the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. Now, we've got many more people, and it's another world now, and we don't have anything like them.
Now, you just said Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton.
Yes.
Not George Washington, not John Adams.
No. But
That's what Lefty Lewis said.
No. Lefty Lewis said those three.
Right.
I didn't decide to write about a book about those three, though I touch on all of these.
Yeah.
In fact, there are major figures in this book. I tried to answer his question. What was the difference between those who invented the country and those who are deconstructing it, I would think, nowadays in politics? I decided to focus not necessarily on those three, though there's a lot of Hamilton and certainly a lot of Benjamin Franklin. I have noticed all through my life, I've been doing American history, George Washington has been erased. He's just thought to be a kind of boring general. Nobody's interested in him. There hasn't been a decent biography of him for years. And he started the whole thing. And if he hadn't held together the Continental Army, we would still be an appendage of England, or they would probably be an appendage of us by now. And I thought I'd answer the question for him. But I don't, of course, because there's no way of answering it. But there were more superior men involved in government and in the ideas of a republic at that time than there have been at really any time since.
But the fact that they would come together in one place, be in one place, not in France, not in Italy, not in London, not in Beijing, but in the colonies of the that would later become the United States, the most interesting and talented people of a century.
Yes. And it was a good century. You know, it was a century of Rousseau and Voltaire. I said, well, one of the reasons, I think, was that they were isolated, and they did read more intensely. They talked a lot to each other. They wanted to figure out what's a good form of government. And Benjamin Franklin, they were coming out of the Constitutional Hall. They just had a constitution prepared. And an old lady said, well, Dr. Franklin, what kind of a country are you going to give us? And he said, a republic, if we can keep it.
Yeah.
So right at the first moment, as Darryl Zanuck used to say, there was an ominous note.
Because he thought that we couldn't keep it, and you believe that he thought that we would end up with despots.
Yes, and he made himself very clear. He's never quoted in biographies what he actually said. He said, look, he said, I accept this, he was a delegate, I accept this Constitution with all of its faults because it will give us good government for a while if it's well administered. He said that it is bound to end, as others have before it, in the corruption of the people. And then they can only be ruled by despots Very few historians ever dare quote that full statement of his. Even Morgan, who's a moral you had on your program, he's
from Yale,
a wonderful biography he did. Even he didn't include that. So I use that as a kind of something ominous in their minds and something that they thought might happen to us. So they have the safeguards.
Do you believe that they didn't care about democracy?
Of course not. The one thing they hated, well, first they hated tyranny.
When we say they, we're talking about like the 7 or 8 founding fathers, or
yeah, well, there are about 100, I would say.
Those who were at the Constitutional Convention, or
yeah, the Constitutional Convention, those who invented the nation, which were very thoughtful men.
But they didn't, as a group, care about democracy?
Oh, no. It gave them the shivers. Majoritarian rule, and they always used Athens as an example, instead of as an example of high culture, which it indeed was, as a mess where everybody could speak out and everybody got together, anybody over 18 could vote on legislation. And they made some horrible mistakes.
Okay, would the argument be that they didn't believe in democracy, the fact that in fact they did not make, they did not open up democracy and the country to all races and all gender and to women as well? Is that the principal argument against the fact that they didn't believe in democracy?
And this is mainly Hamilton, but they also thought, even people like Madison, who's really the father of the Constitution, they thought that in a society like ours, they wanted a republic, not a democracy, in which you elected officials, the best people that you can find, send them to Congress, to the White House, to the courts, and let the best people run the place, because they would have the biggest stake in it, in running it well. So they came up with this 3-pronged government: judiciary, legislative, and executive.
With checks and balances intended.
Well, checks and balances intended, and it worked for a time. There are always things wrong. I mean, you begin with a society that's based on black slavery, and the South, which was the biggest element in the country, even larger basically than New England, the South was not going to give it up. Jefferson and Washington did not give up their slaves except under duress at times. And there was very little talk of abolition. Simultaneously, we were not terribly friendly to new visitors from other parts of the world. What saved us in a way was British common law, Blackstone, which was, he just published his great legal work, and that we had a good grounding in representative government. And England was liberalizing itself. And suddenly you had people like John Bright and in Parliament, true liberals. And this is before the word was demonized by the despots that live among us. And they had a good grip on it. They knew what could go wrong, but they just prayed that it wouldn't go wrong. Then comes the Nullification Acts, in which both Jefferson and Madison, 2 Virginians, Adams comes up with the Alien and Sedition Acts that if you, they're just like the USA Patriot Acts today, that you can be thrown into jail if you speak against the government or you deplore something, and the government can do many arbitrary things. It sort of erases the Bill of Rights. And they felt Jefferson by then as vice president. As vice president to Adams, he's leading a secret movement to get the states to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. And he knows that he can be found guilty. The vice president could have been arrested for sedition.
Right.
And he's quite aware that Adams wouldn't mind doing it. Franklin made a very funny remark about John Adams. He said he's a noble man, he's a good man, a brilliant man. But there are times when he is literally out of his senses. Well, there was Adams, absolutely bonkers during this period.
Bonkers meaning what? He was just
crazy.
Yeah.
Behaving like Genghis Khan, Right. And so Jefferson and Madison went to work to try and nullify the laws of Congress, which, of course, would end the Union. We would no longer have a Union if you said every state can say no to congressional law. You don't have a republic. Well, they got over that one because the Alien and Sedition Acts were abandoned after Adams left office. But that was a close-run thing.
Did you like Aaron Burr the most? Was he your favorite of all the people that sort of came together in one way or another to...
No, he's the only one that I might have wanted to have dinner with.
Why is that?
Because he was brilliant. And
more brilliant than Jefferson? More brilliant than Hamilton?
In his
more
way.
Brilliant than Franklin?
Not than Franklin. But
Not than Franklin.
Yeah,
okay.
but certainly than the other politicians. He was totally without... in a way, he couldn't tell lies. He understood why people did things and their motivations. And he expressed himself beautifully. And he's the one you go to if you want to find out really what happened in the election of 1800 when Jefferson came to power, and he arranged it for him. That's where he was interesting.
If the duel had never taken place, would America have been different?
No.
If Hamilton had lived?
Oh, Hamilton was totally finished by the time of the duel. He was totally discredited. He tried to overthrow Adams, who was the head of the Republican Party, as it was then called. And he wanted to be president, but he never could be. And he was looking for a throne in Mexico, like Burr. They wanted to... Napoleon Bonaparte had absolutely unhinged all these guys. They were all about 5'4", just like Napoleon. And these two little guys who were done in politically in America, Vice President Burr is no longer Vice President.
Right.
Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton is no longer in office. He's tried to wreck his own party and his own president. And each of them is talking to Mexican or Spanish officials about the chances of having a coup going down there and taking over Mexico.
Yeah.
And they were quite serious in their planning. It's just everything went wrong, of course.
I didn't know until, well, I probably read it before, but was reminded. John Adams' tombstone, which he obviously
He wrote. He said, here lies John Adams, who in 1800 took upon himself the task of preventing war with France.
Now, why would he choose that? Because he was the wise person who realized that Bonaparte would be victorious?
Well, it didn't take a genius to realize that. We had no army and no navy, but we had a lot of loudmouths in Congress.
Well,
so there was a great deal of pressure, and a lot from Hamilton, who saw a war as a chance, because he had the rank of Major General by then. He saw the chance of maybe making himself Emperor of the United States or dictator or whatever came his way. So there was this terrible war party, war with France. And we weren't ready for it. I mean, we couldn't have fought it. Adams went back, and he was president by then, and he went back and forth, and then finally he just said, no, we're not going to have a war. And that gave us some breathing room. Otherwise, we would have been a mess. Our trade, which was just beginning to come to life, thanks to Hamilton, would have been wrecked. We lived off.
So there are good things you'd say about Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, he's a genius. Absolutely. He was the Lord Keynes of his day. He was the greatest economist that had ever come along. All from a kid brought up in one island, I think it's Nevis, down in the West Indies. And he was a bastard, literally, and brought up by... there was a whole bunch of Jewish refugees on the island. And he was a bright kid, and they trained him in mathematics. They taught him for nothing. So by 14, he was running quite a large store in the town for a couple of New Yorkers who owned it, who in turn finally sent him to Columbia College, which was then called King's College. No, Hamilton was a superb person, but a terrible character. I mean, he was...
Who had the largest ego?
I wonder. I would probably say Jefferson, because he had the most imagination.
About
everything.
Including his own accomplishments, or?
No, I don't think any of them was conceited in the way that we use the word, you know. People think of somebody who thinks well of himself. Jefferson did think well of himself, but he was full of doubts, suffered from migraine headaches, always a sign something is disturbing him. I would think that he was probably the most rounded of them. Washington is sort of my hero in this book because it's just the tenacity of his character. He was majestic, and everybody knew it, that he was it. He was the nation.
Adams once said, remarked about the idea that Washington might have been chosen because he was 6'3" and Adams was only, what, 5'6" or something?
Yeah. I think Adams made that remark.
Yes.
Adams said somebody said, how did Washington ever get the job of being commanding general of the Continental Army? Adams said, because he was always the tallest man in the room. Adams was capable of very sour remarks, but...
You mourn the fact that, or in fact you have great regret that Washington is not taught better, and there's no real appreciation in the way we teach young Americans about the genius of George Washington.
Well, it's not only Washington.
Or the leadership of George Washington.
No, they don't teach that, and nor do they do a good job with Jefferson, Hamilton, and all the rest of them. I mean, this is the United States of amnesia. I mean, everything is erased every day. History is the least popular of all high school subjects. That's American history. Yes. Purdue used to do a yearly study of high school students, seniors, and they just offered which subjects do you like and so on. Least popular was American history. You have to be a genius and a depraved academic to make our history boring. You just have to have genius. You have to be
Well, you spent your life writing about it.
Yes, I have. And I have been able to interest over the years some people in American history. I shouldn't have to be doing it pretty much alone. Now, we've got some very good historians, and we have some pretty good biographers these days, but they only go so far. They're very careful. The remark about the corruption of the people. It's not going to get into any book except mine this year. And yet there it is, part of Benjamin Franklin's analysis of our situation. So we have a fascinating history. We have one that was an inspiration to the whole world for a century or two. We're now regarded as a sort of joke nation that has turned violent, maybe gone crazy, and we are held in low regard around the world.
Do you think that a different leadership can change that?
In fatalistic moments, and these are fatalistic times, I don't think we can change now. I think we are committed to...
You think we're on a steep slide into what?
Well, despotism. Despotism, a police state, a militarized economy, armies marching into other countries because the president has an intuition that a terrorist might be living on that country's Broadway. Yes. There's going to be more and more of this, and no one will do anything to stop it.
What do you love about the country?
Well, it's in the book.
Its founding fathers?
Well, I like them more than the...
present leadership. All right, but what, it's in the book meaning what? Tell me what it is.
Well, there was the sense,
I'm talking about today, America, 2003.
Well, I can't see it. I only filter it through the past. I mean, to me, the past is as living as today. If I go around and see the general mess of the environment, I mean, you know, ride what hobby horse you want to ride. There are so many things wrong. We are so busy propagandizing ourselves and trying to conquer the rest of the world and get all that oil and so forth and so on. I believe it's every day a bridge falls down in the United States. The country's in great disrepair. The schools are a scandal. And poverty is at large. We're the richest nation in the world, theoretically, but all the wealth seems to be over here
but is your
in few hands.
Okay, I ask you, what do you love about it? I'll come back to that question. Your criticism is more of what we could have been,
well,
and the lost opportunity to build on these men and to build on other people that you have admired in American history, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt or whoever it might be. Nobody but a
total fraud could applaud what we have come to politically. And anyone who does that...
In the quality of our leadership or what?
our institutions.
I just want to raise a couple of points here, not to suggest that you're not right, and everybody knows that campaign funding, that money is at the heart of American politics in many ways, and in fact that it has, and people from John McCain and a whole range of other people have been critical of it and have tried to change it. But at the same time, a lot of people with a lot of money have failed.
Well,
in terms of the political process, so that money alone has not done it. I mean, John Connally would be president. Phil Gramm would have been the Republican nominee.
Well, look, they had baggage. John Connally had been a crook, and that baggage was revealed.
But John Connally's family would like me to say he was acquitted in a court of law.
He was acquitted in a court of law. However, for that acquittal, he lost the presidency. Just because a Rockefeller doesn't get elected the first time doesn't mean that the principle still isn't there. And besides, most of the money is raised by corporate America to put generally its lawyers into the great offices of state. We're in a situation now where every great officer of state, from the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Defense, are almost all of them in the gas and oil business. Now we're not supposed to say a word about Halliburton because that means we're being, radical. Well, it's pretty obvious what has happened. They say, "Oh, you think there's a conspiracy?" I mean, they get hysterical, I said, no, I don't use that word. That conspiracy means you believe in flying saucers. I said, I believe it's a coincidence that every last one of them, including the beautiful Condoleezza, who was for 10 years, I think it was Texaco, she was on their board of directors, are gas and oil. And what are we doing but stealing gas in the Middle East?
Okay, well, I don't know whether she was on the board of directors of Texaco or not.
She was.
Okay, I accept your
Yes.
fact. Do you therefore say that Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor to the President, is simply in her role as Secretary and National Security Advisor carrying the interest of a company she used to be on the board of directors for? Do you have no respect for her integrity, no respect for her sense of self?
You are now moving into very mystical territory. I don't think she has any sense of self. I don't know anything about her.
But why would you say that? Condoleezza Rice was on the board of Texaco, that she therefore, in her role as National Security Advisor is, quote, whatever you, carrying the interest of Texaco, if that's what you're suggesting. And is that what you're suggesting? And if it is, what is your evidence?
Well, the entire administration's behavior in the Middle East is certainly acquisitive of Iraqi oil, particularly of the pipeline that went through Afghanistan and ended up through Pakistan and Karachi. Most of them were involved. There were about 8 of them who are big honchos in the gas and oil business, not to mention our enchanting little president and his statesman-like father.
First of all, the father was not that successful in the oil business.
Well, of course not. He doesn't know anything about it. He's a fixer. You hire a former president to head up the Carlyle Group. They know about the oil, and they pay you as a flack. I mean, they're publicists. So we have really basically a government of publicists for the oil and gas business at a time when we should be working very hard to shift over from gas and oil to hydrogen or whatever.
So, absolutely. Okay, so in other words, we should be much more keen about alternative energy sources. Yes. Clearly, you're right about that. Now, what do you make of the president's recent speech about democracy and suggesting to the Saudis and the Egyptians that they ought to be more interested in democracy than they have been, and that it was...
Well, I think their answer is, since the United States has no interest in it for itself, why on earth should we, the odd man out?
All right, well, you haven't answered my other question, which is, what is it you love about America other than the Founding Fathers?
Well, that's a great deal. That's the heart of the place.
Yeah.
And if you don't have any reverence for them and their work...
But do you find no redeeming value in America today?
Dear God, no.
Nothing.
Well, I suppose...
Nothing in terms of, there's no act on the part of this government or the previous Clinton administration, so we're bipartisan here? And you find no redeeming act that suggests a quality of...
I'll give you General Eisenhower's response.
Oh, is this the military industrial? What? Oh,
No.
I know. Give me a week to think about it.
Give me a week to think about it, yes.
I know. Let me make this point. Senator Kennedy has been enormously critical of the president, calling the war fraud. Yet, I guarantee you, Senator Kennedy, having that strong feeling about the war as you do, would have passion for some of the things that America is doing and stands for. And you can't find anything.
Well, because there isn't anything much good that is going on, Charlie. It is nefarious, to use your word, what we are doing with our secret police, like the CIA, what we're doing to Americans and their rights with USA Patriot Act. We are not doing anything very good for our own people. Now that, to me,
in terms of the welfare and the health care and the education
and everything else.
You can look at the Founding Fathers and talk about the genius, the question that was raised here in this book, Inventing a Nation, Washington, Adams, Jefferson. You can also say, some will argue the same thing about great music. We haven't had a Beethoven, we haven't had a Bach, we haven't had a Mozart, they will say. Why was that?
John Philip Sousa? I gotta go do a show.
All right. Gore Vidal, Inventing a Nation. Thank you. Gore Vidal.
Glad to see you, Charlie.
Thank you for joining us.